the Medical AI Podcast.
Welcome to the Medical AI Podcast with me, Dr. Felix Beecher. Strap in for a 30-minute thrill ride of big ideas. One of the greatest health challenges for Western countries is obesity. 42% of American adults are obese, and that is rising. Why is that an issue? Well, obesity increases the risk of all major diseases, including heart disease, cancer, dementia, and diabetes. Well, what role is AI playing in addressing this? With me to discuss this fascinating area is Dr. Sera Lavelle. Sera, a very, very warm welcome.
Thank you so much for having me. It's my favorite topic.
So, Sera, could you just introduce yourself to the listeners and explain a little bit about what it is that you do?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Sera Lavelle. I'm a clinical psychologist who's worked with emotional eating for the last 17 years. I own two therapy practices in New York City, and I just launched an app that integrates AI with therapy to actually rewire people's brains to think differently about food.
Now, we will get onto your app, but before we do, what is the key problem that we are trying to solve here?
So it's interesting because so many people say, oh, you're trying to cure obesity. Well, I think of obesity as really a byproduct of something psychological going on for some people. Now, of course, there's also, metabolic problems. There could be, other issues, and nutrition advice is something that a lot of people need. However, what you really find is a lot of times people are eating impulsively or compulsively or to deal with their emotions. And, I'm really getting at the heart of the psychology around why people eat, not so much the nutrition advice. Right? I'm getting to the heart of, why is a person saying, hey, I'm not going to eat that today. I want to be healthy, but then they're doing it anyways.
Now, we'll get onto the psychological substrates of poor eating habits, but before we do that, let's talk about why this is an important issue at all. Could we deal with that?
Yeah, so, we're dealing with kind of two different very important issues. One is obesity, and you really have to think about the health risks, as you mentioned, diabetes, heart attacks, blood sugar imbalances. There's a lot of things that go wrong that are strictly kind of more medical. But then I also think, on the other hand, eating disorders have been on the rise since the 1970s. And, obviously there's a correlation between obesity and binge eating disorder. But what you'll find is the more obesity there is within the general population, the more eating disorders there are as well. So countries without a lot of obesity don't have a lot of eating disorders, and countries that do have a lot of obesity do. So the more, for instance, people who are obese, the more anorexia there will be, right? And we really don't talk about the link between these two enough. We talk about giving more nutrition information, but a lot of times I think we're missing the very valid point that eating is emotional. And we now live in a society where there's just abundance of food. And on many levels, we're taught that, hey, food is going to cause your emotional problems, or it's going to make you feel better, or it's going to solve your stress, or it's going to comfort you. You're not going to feel lonely. And, you know, s- in my mind, solving obesity and eating disorders are can be solved in the same methods in many ways.
How far, Sarah, do you think it is possible to generalize about the psychological underpinnings of eating disorders?
I don't know if I could generalize them, right? I mean, so first of all, we want to kind of differentiate between, there definitely are metabolic differences, right? So, one person, it could be psychologically driven and they are overweight because they have binge eating disorder and it's a compulsion. It's something they're really struggling with psychologically. But we don't want to make it sound like that's everybody either, right? I mean, there are some people who are going to have different genes and it's going to be easier for them to be able to kind of stay on track. We also have different dopamine responses in relationship to food. We also have, just like some people are more likely to have a gambling or addiction, like a drug addiction problem, some people are going to be more likely to have like a compulsive um, disposition that's kind of hardwired. That's going to make it more likely that a person's going to binge eat. Now, can both obesity and eating disorders be solved in the same way? If taking out, the metabolic differences, if you are overweight because you are going to food for comfort, because you're stressed, you're like doing it kind of to be bad, that those are the same kind of thoughts as a person has if they're bulimic, or even anorexic. I mean, people think that people with anorexia probably just don't think about food at all. And it's the complete opposite. It's on their mind all the time, but it's almost like this don't eat, don't eat, don't eat. But either way, this kind of like obsession with food that either leads to obesity or leads to an eating disorder, I do think can be solved in many times the same way.
Do you think you could give an overview about the relationships between obesity and different types of psychological disorder?
Oh, it's very complicated, and that's a great question. I mean, certainly depression is related to obesity. I mean, you're going to want to do something to self-soothe, and if you're a person who's like, "Hey, what's the point?" And there's so much about depression that makes you feel like, "Hey, it doesn't matter anyways," and it's easy to go to food for comfort. Um, there's a number, what you'll find, say a person is bipolar, people will have such extreme weight swings. A person could put on 100 pounds in a manic episode, or they could lose 100 pounds in a manic episode. It's more often the latter that a person, when they could go from being, so first of all, if people don't understand bipolar, I want to take a moment to explain that. In bipolar, obviously it's much more complicated, but you have to think in terms of long periods of time that you're in a depressed phase followed by a period of time that you're in a manic phase, which is you feel great, you're energized, you don't need to sleep. A lot of times during that time, you don't feel like you need to eat. So you will find very wild swings with bipolar. A lot of times you could have a person in a manic episode who feels like they don't need to eat for days. They're like, hey, I feel great. I have this energy. I'm not even hungry. And to them, it feels like a great thing at that time.
Before we get stuck into the question of how apps can potentially help, could you give an overview of conventional approaches to helping people with eating problems?
Mhm. Yeah, so first I'm going to talk about the more traditional ways that actually aren't psychological based, right? Um, a brief history of calorie counting is it was really, the calorie was really discovered in 1870s, right? We didn't even tie the calories to food until the 1920s when you had somebody named Lulu Peters who popularized this book in the 1920s, and almost everybody read it because this is the first time we had this awareness, hey, these units of energy, that's what dictates our weight, right? You fast forward to the 1960s, calorie counting became a lot more widespread, particularly with the popularization of, commercialized weight loss products. And, everybody had this kind of 1960s journal where they started to log their food. We still, in many ways, have the same model. If you look at, a lot of traditional weight loss clinics or even traditional weight loss apps, it will be, hey, log your food in a journal and count up what you eat. Now, it's great in theory, right? So a lot of research will say, hey, if you do this for 2 months, you're likely to lose weight if you track everything that you eat. However, it has as high as a 97% drop off in the first week because people don't count their calories, they don't like it, they drop off. And sometimes it actually triggers them to do the opposite. Or people will log their calories for the ones that they liked, but then leave things off. So calorie counting would be one of the main traditional ways that people do things. Another that when you're not going into the psychological so much is, more nutrition education. And a certain percentage of the population does need a lot of nutrition information. Now that's also changed a lot. In the 1920s and 1960s, in the past, we didn't have food labels. We didn't have the internet. We didn't have influencers, talking about the latest fad diet and this is better than that. And this year it's spinach, next year it's kale, then the next year it's super greens. And, now we're kind of bombarded with information. And so sometimes there are people who do need to go to a nutritionist because they're sitting there thinking, hey, I think I'm eating healthy, but I don't quite realize it. And they'll go to a nutritionist and they will make them a great plan. And they might realize, hey, oh, this cereal I was eating I thought was really healthy. And it'll help them to kind of identify, actually, no, the cereal that you're eating is just loaded with sugar and it's putting on more calories than you think. Or maybe, so I'd say the calorie counting is a traditional way. Nutritional information is another very popular way, but they're not really, neither of those are really dealing with the psychological. And what I find is in this day and age, a lot of people know what to eat. A lot of people aren't surprised that a cupcake has more calories in it than a carrot. And we also have this thing called cognitive dissonance, where we sometimes, the more we know something's bad for us, the more we want to do it. So I'll hear my patients say something like, ooh, I want to be bad today. I'm going to go get this pizza. So it's not like they're getting the pizza because they don't know it's bad for them. They're, and I'm not saying people should never eat a pizza, by the way. It's- but they're doing it because it's like, ooh, it's bad. I want to be indulgent. I'm going to do this. Right? So when dealing with somebody, like for instance, if I was going to work with them on a psychological level, I would try to figure out, okay, well, why is it that they want to be bad? And what is it that they think that pizza is going to give them? And sometimes when they can take a step back and analyze why they're doing something, they realize it's not really giving them what they hoped it would have. And they're then more aware of how badly it's making them feel. And so you can identify the triggers and help them become more aware and help them also differentiate kind of emotional cravings from physical cravings so that eating can become a little bit more natural.
So I think then this is fair to say that it's quite a sophisticated approach psychologically. If you compare it, for example, to having a gastric band,
Mm-hmm.
I've not had a gastric band myself, so I can't
Yeah.
fully comment, but the psychological approach is very, very different from that. Is that
Hmm.
fair?
Yeah. And people gain it right back. It's the lap band works for a while, but I always joke that after you get the lap band surgery, they're like you can't eat this or this or this or go over this amount because it might break and it could be dangerous. And I always wonder how much of it is actually the lap band itself or just that extreme fear you have about the lap band and breaking it, and if that's more of it. So there is actually called a like the lap band hypnosis scripts people use that actually make them start to visualize as if they had the lap band, and they find it very, very useful. So it's hard to say how much of it is psychological, even with the lap band.
Very interesting. So
Mm-hmm.
before we talk about your app in particular, could you give us an overview of the
Mm-hmm.
overall landscape of apps for weight control?
Mm-hmm. Well, the current landscape for weight control apps, I mean, if you look at it, I think 80% of them do have calorie counting as the main component. So you look at these things and they're like, hey, now we use AI, but the AI that they're using is often AI to take a picture of their meal to better calculate the calories. So it's all kind of under the lens of kind of assuming that not knowing how many calories you're consuming is the problem. But only about 10% of people report that that is their problem. There are getting to be more mindful eating apps, which would teach just one of the techniques to help a person become a little bit more aware. There are a lot of like more new, so there's calorie counting apps, which I consider to be kind of separate than meal planning apps or nutrition apps. Those are kind of like, hey, we'll help you kind of like with recipes, like nutrition advice. But I don't know of any that's really approaching it from a psychological angle and that being the main feature, other than, what I'm doing, obviously. Mm.
Well, Sarah, why don't you introduce the listeners to your app and describe how it works?
Yeah. Yeah. So what I'm doing with my app is I'm taking what I do in therapy, but I'm making it a way for kind of everyday emotional struggles with food. So what we've done is taken the top three therapy techniques that we use for a person struggling with emotional eating, and that's motivational interviewing, hypnotherapy, and teaching mindful eating techniques. And we make it available through AI so that you can talk to it almost as if you're talking to a therapist at any time. And it's made to actually rewire your mindset so that you don't have emotional cravings anymore and that you're able to stop yourself before you go to that, hey, I want to be bad moment.
Sarah, you used a phrase there, rewiring the mindset. Could you explain a little
Hmm.
bit about what you mean?
Yeah. Yeah, it's a complicated concept, right? Because I can explain what it looks like before and what it looks like after, right? Sometimes we feel like, I even saying heal your relationship with food, I've been thinking about that. It's kind of a funny thing to say because a relationship is two things of equal power, right? You're in a relationship with your spouse, right? Relationship with your friend. We shouldn't be in a relationship with food, but people feel like food has as much power as they do, or even more so sometimes. And when you're really talking about rewiring your mindset to heal your relationship with food, you're talking about making it so you don't feel like food has power over you anymore, that it's just something you eat to give yourself fuel. And so many people, it's so much more complicated than that. It's when can I eat next? How much can I eat? I shouldn't do this, but now I'm going to do it. And using therapy techniques to really kind of get out of that cycle that makes you engage in behaviors that you don't want to be doing, followed by feeling really guilty about doing it. But the idea that food could just be something you consume to feel good, that's what healing your relationship with food really looks like.
Your app is built on Chat GPT, so I would
Hmm.
assume it would
Yeah.
seem pretty familiar to users of large language models. Is that true?
Well, somewhat. So even though it's built on ChatGPT, we've both put in a lot of guardrails so that it's staying in its lane, right? But on top of that, we created a separate vector database. So, there's a whole ChatGPT universe of, a lot of information in there. However, it's not going to be specific to how a therapist would think about it. So what we did is we've loaded the kind of backend database with every blog I've ever written, every podcast I've ever done, like things I might actually say in sessions, things that I know that have helped people, so that when the large language model is kind of deciding how to respond, it's not really pulling from the ChatGPT universe. It's really pulling a lot more from kind of our universe of knowledge. So if you ask ChatGPT something like, "Hey, how could I stop overeating?" it would respond to you completely differently than ours would.
Could you give an example of how it might?
Yeah. Okay. So I could read it verbatim for you. So the example I gave: why can't I stop overeating? Um, ChatGPT would kind of give you some diet advice and some tips, right? Bia says, I'm really sorry to hear that you're struggling with overeating. It can be challenging habit to break, but it's great that you're reaching out for help. Overeating often has roots in emotional or situational triggers rather than just physical hunger. To understand better, could you tell me a bit more about what emotions or situations tend to lead you to eat in ways that don't in line with your goals? And then she'll continue the conversation to kind of help you unravel it. Maybe add some hypnosis in, maybe do some other things, but it's really guiding you as opposed to just responding.
The app is built on Ericksonian hypnosis, which sounds very exotic. Sarah, could you explain a little bit about what that means?
Yeah, yeah. So that's right now what we've done is, for the hypnotherapy scripts, me along with my colleagues, we've actually created the scripts at this point. So, we've all been trained in Ericksonian hypnosis, which takes years to do. So for this version of the app, we created our scripts based on our knowledge. And, we did have a voiceover recorder. But the next phase of the product, what I find very fascinating is we can teach it, and we're in the process of learning Ericksonian hypnosis, which again takes like many years because it's so many different techniques between metaphors and play on words and a lot of different things to make it effective. But they're also very tailored to the individual. So we're going to be able to get to know the person, and because it will know Ericksonian hypnosis, it will be able to create a script on the fly that's tailored to that person. And as opposed to using a voiceover recorder, like a voiceover artist that we use right now, we'll be able to use a, very convincing, pleasant AI voice that will be able to actually create the custom scripts for the person on the fly and put them out just in seconds for them to listen to. So it'd be like having a customized, even better headspace at your disposal, using Ericksonian hypnosis as opposed to just generalized meditation.
Hypnosis, of course, tends to involve the implantation of suggestions to the subject. Could you
Mhm.
give some examples of the kind of suggestions that your app would use?
Mhm. So I don't really conceptualize in the way of it planting suggestions. So, and that is a general conception, and I understand that, but it's let me kind of give you an example. If somebody comes in and says, "I want to stop overeating 5 donuts per night," do I need to give them a suggestion from me, or do I need to kind of suggest that they listen to themselves better? Right? So it's like, yes, you are giving suggestions and you are disguising the way that you do it, but it's kind of inviting them to do something they already want to do that they might be blocking themselves from doing. But you are giving suggestions, and the person can kind of take them or not. And what you do is you disguise it. So an example would be that I give a lot is if you were to tell a person um, to relax, the first, just say, hey, just relax and drift off into space. A person tightens up. They don't want to relax. If you say just relax and don't pay attention to what I'm saying, they're not going to do that, right? Like it almost makes you more on guard. So you might get a metaphor, an analogy that conjures up an image to the point that you're not really listening to the underlying message. So one I often do during an induction would be, you don't want to train your mind to stay on track. It's not worth the trip. And a lot of times a person will hear train, track, and trip without listening to the underlying message. Don't stay focused. It's not worth it.
Users of large language models will understand
Mhm,
that one of the key limitations of how they work currently is memory. They don't tend to remember sessions from one to the other. Is
mhm.
that a problem for your app, Sarah?
It will be able to. We're in a beta, but as like that's the thing with machine learning is that it is going to get to know your patterns more and more and more every day. So for instance, right now they're kind of programmed notifications you get during the day. Hey, it's breakfast time. Can I help you? But in the future, it will start to be able to say, hey, it's actually that meeting at lunch with your boss. That's when you're really stressed and you tend to overeat. It'll start to notice your patterns and it will actually be able to jump in before that happens and say, hey, this is a time you're normally stressed. Can I help?
So, would a user of your app have the impression
Hmm.
that the app understands you as a person, remembering the kind of issues that have been raised in the
Hmm.
past?
Yes, you will definitely get that impression. We don't try to pretend it's a therapist when it's not, but we are, very transparent that this is going to be a lifelike experience. I've had people tell me that they sit there crying, and what's interesting about it is that's sometimes a really good thing. Sometimes people don't even want to open up to their therapist about what they're really doing. So having something lifelike, but that also you don't fear judges you, that you could be totally vulnerable with is can be a really good thing and a very powerful thing, especially when it comes to like there's so much shame around eating.
Okay, so memory is not one of the limitations of your system currently, but what do you think
Mhm.
are the key limitations?
I mean, I think there's a lot of limitations kind of with anything, right? I mean, you never know, we could do 1,000 tests and actually we're pairing with a university researcher to kind of mimic, thousands of people and see if there are kind of ways that you could break it or it responds off topic, right? One thing is, this is not for people with eating disorders, but it is going to bring in people who do have eating disorders, as does any weight loss app. And we do try to find them the right help. We are able to detect if this is a normal everyday emotional struggle or if this is, bulimia. And we will say, hey, can we help you find a therapist in the area? But, you are open and anything, any kind of mental health related, you're opening a can of worms, right? That person's all of a sudden having to think about things that they might not have had to think about, and that is a limitation. Also, it's two, it's two sides of the same coin, right? A plus and a minus.
And let's also not forget that there are, of course, limitations with human psychotherapists too.
Absolutely.
But let me move on to a very difficult question, and that is, how do you see these kind of systems in weight control evolving in the future? And I realize, of course, that's a very difficult question to ask.
Yeah, I mean, people do like getting things more and more personalized. I think, there's already a wave of people being a lot more aware of mental health than they used to be. And there's a lot more awareness that eating struggles are emotional. 10 years ago, it was nothing but weight loss advice. And you'd ask a person why they eat, and they wouldn't come anything. Now, 60% of millennials call themselves, like, refer to themselves as emotional eaters. And 70% of Gen Z actually understand that um, calorie counting and strict diets is bad for your mental health. So I do think there's a big push in general for people to understand the connection between your emotions and eating. And I do think that that's going to continue to evolve. I do think that there'll be, I think within mental health in general, I think is bimodal. I think you're going to want to see a person in person who's really an expert, but maybe you're going to cut down to every other week, and this will be used kind of in between. So it's kind of like you think about it, they going really hand in hand. The limitation of humans is that we can't be there all the time, and we're expensive, and we're not there in the moment, and there's only one of us. However, the limitations of AI is even if it's very human-like, I don't want a robot husband. It's, there's always going to be missing that human component. But even the human component, maybe you're not ready to be vulnerable with somebody, and this can help you get ready to be vulnerable with somebody. If it feels lifelike, it might help you get into therapy.
Now, I have to ask you, Sarah, are other psychotherapists tripping you up in the corridor? Do they hate you? And,
No,
it's a serious question in a way, because, of course, acceptance of these kind of systems in the profession could be critical for its adoption.
yeah, no, definitely. Yeah, definitely. Because I'm on both sides of it, right? I'm on the AI side and I'm the psychologist side. And there is work to be done that some therapists are afraid that you shouldn't have AI in anything, right? And they want to just kind of throw out all of it. And not all of them. But then there are other people out there, on the other hand, that just have no background in mental health whatsoever, creating apps without having any safeguards in place or genuine understanding or knowing what it's like to be on the other side of the couch, right? Like they don't have to visualize what if this goes wrong, the same the way that we do. And helping therapists to understand when AI is done very well with the right safeguards, it's actually helps our field a lot, but it has to be done well. Like I'm able to be accepted by the psychologist because of my clear boundaries in it. I'm very clear that this is not for eating disorders and that it does detect it and let them know, hey, I'm not a therapist. Would you like me to help you find one? And I think with the appropriate things in place, it's very well accepted, but you can't have type 1 or type 2 errors, right? We can't get rid of all AI and say it could replace therapists. And we can't have therapists just saying, hey, if I'm not around, just deal with it on your own and do nothing instead. Right?
Now, Sarah, you're in the process currently of trying to raise venture capital, and very best of luck with that. I would imagine that one of the key questions that you face in that context is about evidence, and how do these kind of systems, or your system in particular, compare with that of other forms of therapy for weight control, whether that be gastric bands or Weight Watchers or Ozempic or whatever it might be? How do you address those kind of questions?
Yeah, so what I can say is the three techniques that we use within the app are very well researched. I mean, that they are the most effective therapy in the field. And then there is plenty of research on each of those techniques delivered through mobile device, like maybe not all together, and but there are those things. And then, you look at also comparable apps that, for instance, the Nerva app, I think is great, or Reverie. They're both apps that use hypnosis, and they're further along. They've already gotten the VC, and they're already being able to do the research on their apps specifically to be able to show that it works for their users. So I'm just excited to be able to get there because these are already proven, maybe not within my app specifically, but they're already proven. They're just not used in this way yet.
Now, I mentioned Ozempic there, and as
Mm-hmm.
we know, Ozempic has made a huge splash in this area. How would you respond to a question if you were asked about the comparative efficacy with your system and Ozempic?
It'd be hard for me to answer if it's better because they're solving different problems, first of all, right? I mean, Ozempic is meant to be short-term weight loss. It's the goal of it isn't rewiring your brain. Now, if they're going to say, hey, is Ozempic going to solve this anyways? I would say absolutely not. 55% of people who are obese don't really want to give themselves a shot of medication once a week. Even of the ones that do, most people drop off after the first year. There are a lot of side effects, and it's not a long-term solution. That being said, I'm actually not against Ozempic. I think for some people, if you're obese, it can feel really insurmountable to try an approach that's gradual. And even if they know deep down that gradual, healthy approach is the best in the long run, sometimes they need to lose the weight first in order to just even start facing it. So I think people could use like using something like my app while they're on it, so that by the time then they get off of it, maybe 6 months or a year later, they already have those healthy habits in place. I think like that combination is great, but I don't think that Ozempic is a long-term plan. There are a lot of things people aren't talking about. People are talking about the health side effects, but people aren't really talking about the mental health side effects. But just very quickly, you know, what it does is it cuts off your dopamine response to pleasurable activities. Pleasurable activities being, of course, eating and gambling and alcohol. And they're like, hey, that's great. But it also cuts off your dopamine response to getting a job promotion or having a good conversation with a friend, and so they're kind of starting to come out with this like Ozempic personality because people are a little flat on it, and they are starting to look at some of the research is coming out that especially if you're already on an antidepressant, um, it's a huge increased risk of, going to a major depressive episode. And also there have been a lot of suicides. So I don't know all the statistics around it, but there's enough that they are looking into it
Well, Sarah, you've given
now.
such a good account of the area, and
Thank
I
you.
very much appreciate your time. I've just got one last question, and that is, what is your favorite example of a medical AI system nothing to do with your own?
Everything for me is always going to be mental health related. My favorite app that I like right now is an app called Reframe. And I do think it's somewhat similar in that it's not saying, hey, this person who needs to go inpatient for alcoholism and needs to go through detox. But there's a lot of people who are just like, I drink too much and I want to cut back. And it gives a lot of practical advice. It also asks you why. It integrates AI. And I think they have a very good scientific board. And I think they're just doing a great job taking the shame out of a person wanting to cut back on drinking, normalizing it, and providing genuine actionable steps.
Well, Sarah, thank you so much. These are issues of such importance that I really hope that these kind of systems could make a meaningful breakthrough. And thank you so much for your time. It's been an absolute pleasure having you on.
Absolutely. Thank you. It's been fun.
Thanks for listening. Ping me on LinkedIn if you have any ideas on new subjects or guests.